You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Koku. And tonight we're doing another episode, as you know. We're doing a reading called Pan-Africanism and African Governments by Claude Ake. And this is a pretty old paper, actually. But it's good to look back and look at the wisdom that, our ancestors, our elders had. And so we're going to read this paper tonight, Pan-Africanism and African Governments. Before I do that, though, I want to remind you guys that this show, the Bitter Medicine Podcast, is a part of a podcast network called KWAZ Radio. There are other shows on this network, shows that you should already be tuned into, but take a listen.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-Black perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
So yeah, make sure to check out those shows as well as the Queen's Council podcast, only on KWAZ Radio. Okay, here we go. We have this paper called Pan-Africanism and African Governments. Let's get into it right now. By the way, if you guys haven't already, make sure you guys join the Discord. We have a Discord server. We're always hoping to have more people join. As you may or may not know, if you're new here, you won't know. We are working on a curriculum, an African-centered curriculum. I've been making some headway, actually, on my own, doing a lot of the writing, but it'll be nice to have a few other people to help with research, people to help writing, so if you're interested in working on an African-centered curriculum, join the writing team. Join the writing team by clicking the link in the chat room. In the chat room, I see Kevin Care 42 is here. Kevin Care 42 has become a regular of the show. NYC Beauties is also here, saying greetings. You guys check out NYC Beauties, man. Their YouTube channel is pretty dope. It's a photographer. Kevin Care 42 is a photographer at NYC Beauties, and they're taking pictures of some beautiful sisters, right? Part of that Beauty of the Black Woman project. So you guys make sure to head over to his channel as well. Subscribe, give him a like on all his videos, and that'll give the encouragement to keep doing a job well done. All right, appreciate you for being here, Kevin Care 42 and NYC Beauties. Okay, but yeah, join the Discord if you haven't already, and if you just want to join as a fan of the show, by all means, join as a fan of the show. I see the pro-Black perspective is making an appearance. Another regular, good dude right there. Make sure to follow him on Twitter. His Twitter is at Oni Tasset, ONITASET. I think I spelled that right. And also the Pro-Black Perspective is podcast on KWAZ Radio. Make sure you guys tune in to his show. Make sure to like and subscribe. Click the bell so you are notified when he's on again. But he's a pretty regular presenter on the his show on Sunday mornings called The Worship. They should tune into the Sunday worship of the pro-black perspective. Peace to you, brother. Thanks for being here as well. So, Pan-Africanism and African Governments by Claude Ake. Again, this is an old paper, but again, it's good to get wisdom or insight from the elders, from the folks who came before us, right? The last decade has seen the proliferation of organizations and institutions which have broadened the scope of social communication between African peoples. The sophistication of a broad African perspective, which tended to be a monopoly of top-level leadership, is now permeating the lower strata of African society. Previously, consciousness of a common African destiny had to be induced by the elite. But in recent times, the masses have become sensitive enough to events in the continent to cause anxiety to leaders whose performances have to be constantly compared. This nascent psychological unity is standardizing expectations throughout the continent. Thus, events in one part of the continent tend to echo in another. Following the alleged plot against Houphouët Boigny's regime, the Ivory Coast National Assembly passed a law on January 17, 1963, authorizing the government to impress into public service anyone whose activities are considered detrimental to national security. Anticipating a similar plot, the legislature of the Upper Volta passed a law on January 29th, creating a high court of state to deal with offenses against the state committed by deputies, ministers, and other officials, and also empowered the government to impress any person into forced labor in the national interest. Colonel David Thompson, the leader of the abortive coup d'etat in Liberia, was reported to have argued that there was no reason why 5,000 Liberian soldiers could not capture a government if 250 Togolese soldiers succeeded. The recent crop of mutinies in East Africa centered around the common theme of Africanization and the improvement of the service conditions of the army. This emergent psychological unity, in effect, puts leadership and institutions alike on constant trial. Every success in tackling the problems of new nationhood in any part of the continent weakens the ability of leaders in other parts to hide their ineffectiveness behind the plea of limited resources or lack of experience. It is no longer sufficient for an African leader to perform satisfactorily. He must strive to be more satisfactory than other leaders. It is somewhat irrelevant and certainly ineffective to criticize an African leader by Western criteria. He could reply that the Western leader does not face similar problems, and his resources are not as dramatically limited as the African leaders. But it is much more embarrassing to criticize him by reference to another African leader, battling with roughly identical problems and commanding equally meager resources. What would be, for you guys listening to me live especially, what would be the most embarrassing criticisms that you could levy on African leadership today? Like, what do you think would be, embarrassing to them today? The pro-black, in the chat room, the pro-black perspective puts up the Black Power fist. Kevin K42 says the European left the African countries hamstrung and expected them to get up to speed. Absolutely. Absolutely. But we know that there was ineffective leadership as well, right? And ineffective leadership today. What would be the critique that you think that will most embarrass African leadership today? In the sensitivity of the masses to events in the African continent lies some of the explanation for the increasing repressiveness of the new African governments. Popular awareness of the achievements of other African governments gives a tremendous urgency to the revolution of expectations, and involves disturbing consequences for political stability. As some of these expectations are not easily met, governments usually tend to repression as a short-run solution. The fact that opposition groups often find support in other African countries gives opposition a subversive air and increases the nervousness and hence the intolerance of the regime. Y'all hold on 1 second for me. Got a scent of a burning smell. I didn't like that, so I had to check that out. Okay, in the chat room, Kevin K42 says, letting China have its way in your country, not having an economic plan for your people. That's his answer to my question. What would be embarrassing? Just to play devil's advocate to what Kevin K says, he also says a lot of these African leaders are like the character. I like the character. You know, I interviewed a gentleman, RJ Magdi, and he was telling me, he said something interesting in my interview, that, you know, the Chinese are doing stuff that the Africans couldn't, essentially is what he said. Or at least what the Africans weren't doing, they were doing. So some people might complain and say that, well, some people might retort and say that, well, the Chinese are actually building some infrastructure. Now, we know nothing comes for free, right? But some people might say, hey, you know, these guys are actually doing something and making something happen. What do you say to that? In the chat room, KW Don 7 says, one of the most embarrassing critiques of leaders on the continent is that when they have medical issues, they're going for foreign countries for medical procedures. That is true. A lot of African leadership over historically, have died in Europe, right? Or were returned home just before death, but were treated in Europe. That's true. That is embarrassing. Imagine that. Wow, that's two good responses there. I like what Kevin K42 said. I like what KW Don 7 said as well. My only thing about what Kevin K42 said is that some people would argue that the Chinese are actually doing something. And my question is, well, what do you say to that? In the sensitivity, let me see. In the sensitivity of the masses to events in the African continent lies some of the explanation for the increasing repressiveness of the new African governments. I read this before, I know. Popular awareness of the achievements of other African governments gives a tremendous urgency to the quote-unquote revolution of expectations and involves disturbing consequences for political stability. As some of these expectations are not easily met, governments usually tend to repression as a short-term solution. The fact that opposition groups often find support in other African countries gives opposition a subversive air and increases the nervousness and hence the intolerance of the regime. In every country in Africa where the opposition party has tended to assume supra-territorial dimensions, the government has curbed it very sharply. Sylvanus Olympio suppressed the Juventus Union Democratique des Populations Togolese party because he considered it the instrument of Nkrumah's intrigue in Togoland. Mokhtar Ould Dada liquidated the Nada party because in being pro-Morocco, when Morocco was claiming République Islamique de Mauritanie, it was essentially denying the legitimacy of Dada's government. Again, in October 1959, Niger Republic's ruling party, Progressi Nigerian, outlawed the Swabo party for supporting the Parti de la Fédération Africaine and the Mali Federation. These examples illustrate the tendency of an African government to be impatient with an opposition group supporting another African government differing in policies from its own. The repressive trend is reinforced by the tensions arising from the differences in the attitudes of African leaders to Pan-Africanism. This repressive trend is reinforced by the tensions arising from the differences in the attitudes of African leaders to Pan-Africanism. Although there is consensus on the broad aims of Pan-Africanism, there is little agreement about priorities and methods for realizing them. Considerations of prestige and belief in the superiority of their methods have moved some African leaders to take great pains for the promotion of their brand, Pan-Africanism. To this end, they try to transmit their influence through various organizations in the country whose Pan-African orientations they wish to change. I'll pause here quickly and ask this question. How many brands, quote-unquote brands of Pan-Africanism are you aware of? Right? How many brands of Pan-African are you aware of? In the chat room, I lost my space. The pro-black perspective says these people aren't embarrassed by anything. I feel you a little bit. You know, that was my first thought too. Like, do these African leaders care at this point? KW Don 7 says when African leaders speak at the UN General Assembly, they have an empty audience. The pro-black perspective says the Chinese have the infrastructure to do things. It's going back to my mention of the RJ Mahdi interview where he said, look, the Chinese are coming in and doing stuff that the folks there aren't doing. That's essentially, to paraphrase, right? Kevin Care482 rightly says the Chinese are building roads and railway to colonize Africa, right? I think, speaking of railway, I remember a discussion on the Pan-African Discord server where they were showing railroads, and Oni could probably elaborate more in the chat room about it. They were showing railroads. I think they were comparing two time periods, and basically most of Africa is not accessible by rail. And if you have, you know, a colonization scheme going on, as I suspect China does, expect them to start building railroads in all those inaccessible parts of the continent. The pro-black perspective says it was embarrassing that the Chinese built that meeting hall and bugged it. Black folks probably still use it, right? Yeah, they right now eating a jollof dinner with the Chinese listening to them. Kevin Care42 says to the pro-black perspective, these misleaders are just puppets for China. Isn't that something? What's the Chinese guy who Boyce Watkins worked for again? You know, that's what's going on there. Kwame Nkrumah's attempt to control the trade unions of the more conservative African governments affiliated to the International Conference of Free Trade Unions is a case in point. Nkrumah's view is that affiliation to the ICFTU and genuine Pan-Africanism are incompatible because the ICFTU is an instrument of Western imperialism. Therefore, in May 1961, he persuaded the Casablanca Conference to launch the All-African Trade Union Federation, which was to be independent of all trade unions outside Africa. Secretary General of the AATUF, John J. Tetega, was made a special ambassador by Nkrumah and was urged to crusade for the acceptance of the AATUF throughout Africa. Antigua vowed to wage total war on African governments that continued to depend on the ICFTU. You guys heard the fire engine passing by, so I was right. I did smell something burning. Thankfully, it's not by me, and hopefully it's not too serious or dangerous of a situation. Crusading Pan-Africanism of the Nkrumah brand. Right? Remember that question I asked? Well, what are all these different brands of Pan-Africanism? Crusading Pan-Africanism of the Nkrumah brand is compelling many African governments to insulate their countries against alien influence. Such isolation may take one of many forms. It may mean restriction of intercourse with certain African leaders, as when the Nigerian Ministry of Internal Affairs prevented Tetega from entering Nigeria because he was, quote unquote, likely to conduct himself so as to be dangerous to peace and good order in Nigeria. It may lead to peaceful assimilation of opposition parties into the government, as when Mokhtar Ould-Dadda's party du Regroupement Mauritanian absorbed the remnants of the pro-Moroccan entity Mauritanian in 1959, and the pro-Mali Union National Mauritanian, after the breakup of the Mali Federation. It may also lead to the repression of opposition groups, as the exile of Ngo Blase from the Ivory Coast for his relationships with Ghana and Guinea. Whatever form it takes, the process of insulation seems to produce the same result. It always leads to the reduction of political differentiation within the country, and thus enhances the trend to authoritarianism in African politics. What are your guys' view on that statement? Right? That Pan-Africanism essentially, right, as it tries to insulate, right, it still produces this problem. So you're trying to insulate from these different factors inside and outside of the country, right? Foreign and domestic. But at the same time, it leads to this political problem, right, that causes authoritarianism in African politics. Do we have good examples of authoritarianism in Africa? So KW Don 7 makes a point. There is Pan-African nationalism, Pan-African socialism, and Gaviism. That's a good point. Kevin Kerr answered my previous question about Boyce's master, Charles Wu. So KW Don 7. KW Don 7 also goes on to say Nkrumah is a Pan-African socialist, much like W.E.B. Du Bois and Kwame Ture. Yeah, a lot of those 60s guys were overwhelmingly socialist. Kevin K42 says it's like two gazelles fighting one another and not seeing the approaching lions, the outsider. Absolutely. Absolutely. And then they have Africa on this hamster wheel, constantly fighting one another as the enemy gets closer. It's a constant battle. To continue, one other way in which Pan-Africanism influenced domestic politics is by encouraging policies which maximize political independence. It's become more important than ever for an African leader to be or appear to be independent of non-African nations in order to avoid the charge of being an imperialist puppet and contemptuous treatment. The premium on political independence influences African governments in two principal ways. First, it adds impetus to the quote-unquote Africanization of influential positions. Admittedly, political or economic prudence may weigh against Africanization. where the men most qualified to fill European positions are hostile to the ruling elite, the government may decide to postpone Africanization until it can train dependable agents. So first of all, Africanization is not a bad thing. But the idea that when it comes to influential positions, right, that African men who would be qualified to fill these positions that Europeans had prior, right, would be hostile to the ruling elite. The reason why there'll be hostility is because the ruling elite tend to still follow, you know, the European that formerly filled the position. So when they say later on that, you know, what they want to do is be able to train dependable agents, well, I think agent sounds like an appropriate term, right? But what are they trying to train them to do? You feel me? What are they trying to train them to do? This happened in northern Nigeria, where the mass exodus of Europeans threatens economic stagnation as in East Africa. Africanization has been slow. Africanization, however, has been the rule rather than the exception, and a government that fails to accept it runs a considerable risk. The recent labor unrest and mutinies in East Africa, particularly in Kenya and Tanganyika, are in part the repercussions of half-hearted Africanization. When we talk about, you know, Pan-Africanism and returning to the continent as a people, right? How do you guys feel about Pan-Africanization? In other words, how do you guys feel about, you know, Caribbean folks holding positions in countries in the continent? Or you know, the ADOS FBA type, or the UK, or the Black Brits, you know, the UK Africans, or the South American Africans. How do you guys feel about those things as well, right? The Pan-Africanization of the continent. In the chat room, Kevin K42 says, as someone said in the last broadcast, Africans buy all these weapons, point them inwards. This is just suicide. I think it might have been KW Don 7 who said that, but it's true. All right, point the weapons outside, not inside. To continue, second, it leads to the abolition of certain reserve powers, which the ex-colonial regimes formerly employed. Thus, the governments of Ghana and Nigeria no longer accept the jurisdiction of the Privy Council. Indeed, the movement to republicanism in the former British dependencies is principally a way of shedding the remaining prerogatives of the British Crown. Republican status eliminates the office of the governor, who is constitutionally a representative of the Queen of England. Abolition of imperial prerogatives and the process of Africanization are among the ways in which Pan-Africanism contributes to the authoritarian trend in African politics. Let me read that again. Abolition of imperial prerogatives and the process of Africanization are among the ways in which Pan-Africanism contributes to the authoritarian trend in African politics. The elimination of imperial prerogatives usually means increased power for an African government. Thus, Nkrumah's ability to manipulate the Ghana judiciary is enhanced by the fact that the Privy Council no longer has jurisdiction in Ghana. Y'all understand what this guy is saying, right? To the extent that colonial officials symbolize impartiality among competing African groups, Africanization increases the insecurity of minority groups. Africanization means an increase in disposable spoils, opportunity for victimizing political opponents, and the entrenchment of loyal supporters in key positions. It's easy to see how a government can use it to consolidate power. Think about what he's saying here, right? In the chat room, the good fellow Onitase from the pro-black perspective says, I don't mind the Pan-Africanization, but if it happens, it happens. Okay. Because the reason I asked that question is it's kind of tied to what I just read, right? Like, are we going to have a situation where returning Africans from the diaspora, right, who might be Jamaican, Bahamian, St. Lucian, and all this old stuff, right? Like, who, of course, especially in the beginning, will still hold their identity as Africans from these different satellite nations, right? Who they will become the quote unquote minority in that type of paradigm. And is that something to be worried about, right? Where they're the minority, right, in that type of paradigm, and folks are swinging the lumber, right, and potentially, right, causing problems for them, NYC Beauty says Rwanda, right. In the economic sphere, Pan-Africanism emphasizes rapid growth, not only to demonstrate that African peoples can catch up with the industrialized world, but also as an essential support of political independence. As a consequence, Pan-Africanism intensifies the pressures on African leaders for economic mobilization. In the first place, the leader who does not want to be dubbed an imperialist stooge has to limit his economic dependence on European powers, and this demands greater domestic economic effort. More than that, communication between African peoples has given a special urgency to the quote-unquote the revolution of expectations. The failure of any government becomes more dangerous in an atmosphere in which the people are conscious that similar economic problems are being solved in other parts of Africa despite the limitations of meager capital and lack of skills. It may be objected that instead of contributing to economic development, Pan-Africanism retards it by diverting attention from domestic failures. This must be frankly admitted. Pan-Africanism can be manipulated as a quote-unquote emotional New Deal to obscure domestic failures. What do you guys think about that statement? Nevertheless, it is likely that the extent to which a leader can do this depends on his prestige within the government, and in the long run, prestige will depend, at least in part, on his domestic, political, and economic achievements. Pan-Africanism's pressures for economic growth make an additional contribution to authoritarian tendencies in African politics. Rapid economic development of predominantly illiterate and agrarian societies involves profound social transformation. To promote economically rational behavior may lead to the near collapse of traditional norms, with disastrous consequences for social control. The modernizing elite has to contend with the resistance of the traditional aristocracy, the unsettling effects of class displacement, and the customary reluctance to postpone consumption in the interest of capital accumulation. All this creates a potentially explosive atmosphere, and a minimum of political stability cannot in such circumstances be guaranteed without forceful leadership. Wow, okay. Statism is an indispensable ingredient in the politics of developing countries. Lack of substantial private capital, entrepreneurial skill, and incentives thrusts the initiative of development on the state. And this in turn increases its power. What do you guys think about what I just read just now? What do you think it's about what I just read just now? While you guys answer that, let me take a quick station ID break and I'll come back on the other side to read your answers.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
And we're back. Also check out the Queen's Council podcast as well. The Harsh Reality podcast just dropped an episode, I think it was Sunday, as well as the Pro-Black Perspective dropped its Sunday worship as well. Check all of them out. You know, I check them out regularly. Sometimes I go back and listen to them because sometimes there's some gems dropped in these shows. In fact, oftentimes there's gems dropped that are worth re-listening to. NYC Beauty says study China and Japan. They both went through a period called the Warring States. The Pro-Black Perspective says, I know for some countries you need to be a resident for 10 years to become a citizen. After 10 years, you're probably not going to be a Jamaican anymore, in the same sense. That's a good point. Very good point. The Pro-Black Perspective says we'll always be foreigners, but it'll be different if we spend a decade there and become citizens. In which, I think it'd be good to be politicians too. I agree. NYC Beauty says you had the warlords carving up sections with Japan. He's continuing his thought about study China and Japan. He said you had the warlords carving up sections with Japan. What caused them to modernize was new technology, education, and letting go of certain traditions. With China, it was the propaganda and nationalism. Yeah, and a lot of things you just mentioned are the steps to really pull our folks out of the doldrums, right? Modernize, embrace technology, become major players in technology, which requires education, and the education that we need is one that's centered around our people, focus on solving the problems that we have, right? We gotta let go of certain traditions, certain prejudice, etc. Right? And we gotta start dealing with more positive propaganda. And definitely we gotta boost our nationalism as Africans, right? Or as Pan-Africans for that matter. Right? Love it. Love the feedback. So to continue. So far, we have shown that the economic and political policies which Pan-Africanism encourages are essentially authoritarian. There is an interesting footnote to this. Even when an African leader refuses to be impressed by these pressures, he will still have to be authoritarian. That's an interesting thing to say. For instance, a conservative African leader who rejects militant Pan-Africanism will have to insulate his institutions against the influence of other leaders, and this will make his political control more pervasive. Again, there are two alternative reactions to the quote-unquote revolution of expectations, which Pan-Africanism has given a special urgency. The leader has to modernize very quickly, a process that tends to authoritarianism. I don't know why I'm tripping on this word. Or become increasingly repressive on those who make demands he cannot satisfy. Either way, the pressure is towards authoritarianism. To continue, this, however, is not the whole story. There are ways in which Pan-Africanism encourages liberal rule. Although African leaders hold that it is a manifestation of quote-unquote colonial mentality to copy European political institutions slavishly, they all accept the democratic principle. There are, of course, democracies and democracies. The fact that everyone proclaims democracy limits African expectation of what an African government can do. But if theory and practice diverge very widely, criticism can usually be expected. A section of the African press, particularly in Nigeria, was severely critical of Nkrumah's preventative detention and more recently of his dealings with the Ghana Supreme Court. Remember, this is an old paper from the 60s. It may well be that the increasing isolation of Nkrumah, clearly discernible since the Pan-African Conference met at Addis Ababa in 1963, is a reaction against extremism. That African governments are sensitive to such criticism is evident. If they were not, the lengthy statements explaining their repressive politics and the endless trials would scarcely be necessary. Pan-Africanism may promote political liberalization by bringing together professional and private associations of different nationalities into international interest groups ready to defend themselves wherever their rights and privileges may be threatened. In recent times, we have seen African trade unions, lawyers, journalists, educators, sports organizations, and authors coming together to exchange ideas and discuss common problems. By tactfully exploiting international support, a particular national association should be able to obtain more respectful treatment from its government. The willingness of these national associations to help one another has already been dramatized by the trade unions. Some other groups are becoming more disposed to defend their counterparts all over the continent. When Abayomi Cassell was dismissed from his post as Liberia's Attorney General after reading a paper on Liberia's judiciary at the Lagos Law Conference in January 1961, the Nigerian branch of the International Commission of Jurists pressed for his reinstatement. Pan-Africanism may also encourage better tolerance for minority groups within African countries. This is what we talked about a second ago. Right? Because of historical circumstances, certain ethnic groups find themselves scattered among several African states. The Somali may be found in the Somali Republic, French Somaliland, Kenya and Ethiopia. There are Maasai in Kenya and Tanganyika. The Iwis may be found in Ghana, Dahomey, and Togoland, and the Yoruba in Nigeria, Dahomey, and Ivory Coast. The Hausa form a substantial minority in almost every West African country. The fact that any government dealing roughly with such a minority group knows that it may be raising international issues makes for the security and toleration of such groups. Pan-Africanism may also help in the sense that where it promotes good relations between two African nations, A and B, a minority group in A with ethnic affinities to B is likely to be treated with respect and deference to B's feelings. To put it in more concrete terms, we are suggesting that the lot of the Somali as minority groups in Kenya and Ethiopia is improved to the extent that the Somali Republic, Kenya, and Ethiopia enjoy cordial relationships with one another. Okay, I get that. So I guess similarly can be said if the continent does more work with, these Caribbean satellites, or does work. I mean, is it possible for the continent to do direct work with the population of black folks in America and the UK? Considering that the folks in America and the UK are not the leaders? Is that even possible? What about South America? Is it possible there? Because the idea here is, if we're in good accord, and the extension is, if we're in good accord and one of us is treating our minorities really well, maybe, you know, the others who we are in good accord with will also do the same. You know, earlier, NYC Beauties, I think it was, or Kevin Care 42 said something along the lines of, we got to give up like some of these traditions or whatever. Is tribalism something? This is a question for you guys. Again, I learned from you guys, and I bounce my thoughts off of what you guys suggest. Is tribalism something that should be given up in the continent? And is it a prerequisite for us to get the continent to a place of power? Number one, should tribalism be done away with in the continent? And is that a prerequisite, or one of the prerequisites towards the continent achieving power? NYC Beauty says the problem is that we as black people are taught by outsiders to be individuals. Look at the 70s blaxploitation movies. Superfly is a great case study versus that of the spook who sat by the door. Yeah, NYC Beauty goes on to say you do not see outsiders being individual from the group. What you saw with the riots at the Capitol was different Muzungus putting aside their differences for the mission. NYC Beauty goes on to say, yes, we should give up the petty tribalism for a brighter future. So NYC Beauty thinks we should give up the tribalism. What say the others of you who are here with me tonight? There's about 9-10 people in here concurrent. What says you guys? Should we give up the tribalism? Is that, you know, one of our prerequisites to power? All right, Kevin, I'm sorry, NYC Beauties weighed in, and as I'm looking at it, I see Teetums. I think Teetums is Baka. Teetums says, Hotep family. Hotep to you, brother. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining us. Right, but that's an interesting thought. Because tribalism, you know, as much as Africa is about the group, right? When you about your group or your tribe, that's also kind of like being about the self, in a sense. I know it's a group, but you're about your group and not so much the other groups. That's almost individualistic to me. Right? Yeah, Teetums is Baka. Welcome. By the way, guys, make sure hit the like button. Make sure, if you're new here and you're listening in the background, make sure you subscribe as well. All right. I see we have almost about 10 people in here and 4 likes. Let's try to get the likes up a little bit. All right. I'd appreciate that. To continue. There is another side to this hypothesis. An ethnic minority may be the scapegoat of a government's antipathy to another government or intensify its fear of subversion. In that case, it may be victimized. Pan-Africanism thus exercises both an authoritarian and a liberalizing influence. But a careful look at the picture of the strands will show that the authoritarian trend is easily the more dominant, mainly because it arises from the attempt to grapple with the more urgent problems of political survival. It may be that the liberalizing potential of the movement will increase as African governments develop greater confidence in themselves and in one another. But at the moment, circumstances favor the authoritarian trend. to you guys listening, do you think Africa today still favors the authoritarian trend over the liberalizing trend? Right? In the chat room, KW Dawn 7 says the goofy tribes gotta go. It worked in Rwanda. The goofy tribes. I get exactly where you're coming from. Tatum says thank you to NYC Beauties. NYC Beauty says, when I used to do combat Aikido, the Grandmaster had to get rid of certain techniques for today's streets. A lot of the techniques were from the turn of the 20th century, right? And that's a real thing that NYC Beauties are saying there. You always have to revise, right? You got to strategize. And as a matter of fact, I think Onitase has this as like a tagline. Like, how does it go again? Strategize, technologize. What's the other one? It's not revise. But the pro-black perspective is around. He could answer that question for me. But that's the thing that you got to be doing, man. You have to always be updated. That's why we're talking about this curriculum. We looked at a curriculum and critiqued it in the Discord server, and most people kind of agreed that very vague. Right? I mean, it means well, but very vague. It essentially turns out that you know how to read and write, and you might know, you might have memorized some African facts, right? But, again, that's where you gotta take that and say, okay, it's a cool beginning, and you gotta update that, right? So I hope you guys who haven't already will join us as we start to get some of this work done towards updating an African-centered curriculum. But you always have to do that. And some things that you did in the past won't really work today. And you have to be mature enough, you have to be sensible enough, and all those things to be able to get rid of what doesn't work, keep the things that work, and actually try to bolster them or enhance them as you work towards something that's going to help you in the future, right? Kevin K42 in the chat room says, yes, many African misleaders do not want to give up power to the youth. Goes on to say they have to go to oppression of the people. Yeah. So that he's answering the question, is Africa still leaning towards authoritarian? And if we're honest, we gotta say yeah. To hold on. Who was the most recent guy? There was a recent guy on the continent who was pushing for more terms as the leader, etc. I forgot the name now. And the people were kind of pushing back against it, right? And of course, he cranks up some oppression, right? There was a guy recently, late this year, early this year, who I'm thinking about, whose name I can't bring up. Kevin K42 goes on to say another thing about updating. When I started my photography career, I was shooting film. When I started covering the Yankees and other professional sports, I had to upgrade to digital. Yeah, you always gotta, these things go hand in hand. You always gotta strategize, you always got to technologize, right? If you want to improve, right? If you want to stay in the game, right? To continue, when we put together all the influences of Pan-Africanism discussed in this paper, we see that their net effect is to reduce institutional differentiation within Africa. To put it another way, Pan-Africanism promotes institutional uniformity in Africa by focusing the attention of African governments on common problems and pressuring them into adopting certain standard solutions to these problems. This conclusion is not as startling as it appears. We may recall that Pan-Africanism began as a reaction against the European degradation of African peoples. With the coming of independence to many African nations, the movement has become more positive in orientation. The emphasis is now on maximizing Africa's influence in the world and cooperating to meet the challenge of nation building. But at every stage, the movement has always involved the quest for common solutions to common problems. Increased inter-African intercourse, consciousness of the continent's uniqueness, a vague belief in common destiny, and the failure of certain important Western institutions have predisposed Africans to look increasingly within the continent for the answers to their problems. Now remember, let me just pause here for a second. This paper is written like in 1965. Have we progressed any further than these few lines of words right here? Increase inter-African intercourse, consciousness of the continent's uniqueness, a vague belief in a common destiny, and the failure of certain important Western institutions have predisposed Africans to look increasingly within the continent for the answers to their problems. I ask you guys who are here with me live or listen to the playback, are we any much further away from these words from 1965? To continue in trying to benefit from one another's experience, their political and economic development is taking a stereotyped pattern. Yeah, Tatum says Katara of Ivory Coast. Yeah. There's been quite a few abusing term limits. So yeah, there are quite a few, and I think it was Katara, right? The pro-black perspective comes back and says militarize. I think that's what you meant. What you said. Organize. It's strategize, technologize, and militarize. Right? Cheatham says it could be Foray Nasingbe. It's Togo though. Okay. Kevin Kerr says that Tatum's, their days are numbered. Also, their family and heirs will be outcasts, right? I'm almost at the end of this paper. You guys stick around to the end. I have a question for you guys, important question for you guys, so stick around. In trying to benefit from one another's experiences, their political and economic development is taking a stereotype pattern. This uniformity in African development may be illustrated by the response of African governments to their economic needs. In the first place, the economic philosophy is essentially the same. The apparent differences are merely variations on the same theme. Paul Sigmund has rightly pointed out that behind Senghor's African socialism, the Nyeri's communitarianism, or Sekou Touré's communocracy is, quote unquote, is a common commitment to a new form of development which will allow planning and central control of the economy while continuing to permit some measure of private initiative. Okay. One may add that Balawa's mixed economy and Nkrumah's fourth sector theory amount to much the same thing. There is scarcely any doctrinaire adherence to capitalistic individualism or communist collectivism. Strictly speaking, such economic principles are not eclectic. They are better conceived as responses to the urgent demands of a concrete situation. The leading economic role of the state is a frank recognition of the fact that roads, bridges, electricity, and other basic services have to be provided to attract investment, that there is a shortage of private wealth and entrepreneurial skill. and that the social and psychological changes involved in accelerated economic development are too wrenching to be left undirected. On the other hand, the aim is not statism, but maximum growth. And where government control fails to promote this, it is discarded. In 1960 and 1961, Guinea nationalized all major public utilities, the assets of foreign banks and insurance companies, and the bauxites du Midi, and seemed to be on the way to socialism. But in mid-1961, in the heat of these nationalizations, she abolished, for inefficiency, the Comptoir Guinéen de Commerce Extérieur, a government monopoly established in 1959 to regulate all foreign trade, and thus showed that nationalization was only part of the pragmatic drive for development. And Nkrumah may sometimes sound like a Marxian socialist, but he values private investment. He too realizes that there is no alternative to pragmatism. The same unilateral development is evident in African politics. Here, the chief motivation seems to be insecurity. African governments feel insecure because of their inexperience. The centrifugal pull of tribalism, the unsettling effects of rapid change, and the rising expectation of material betterment, which dwarfs their achievements and breeds discontent. Unfortunately, these problems have no easy, short-run solutions. Tribal sentiment cannot be banished overnight by a stroke of legislation. A disoriented society will need time to find a new equilibrium, and economic efforts will take years to yield heavier pay packets. In such circumstances, the only effective short-run solution to instability is authoritarianism. The tendency to the one-party state in Africa today is, in this context, a natural development. Do you guys agree with that? Recently, hold on, let me check something. Organize. Okay, yeah. The pro-black perspective says organize. My bad. Tatum says to Kevin Kerr, I hope they are wiped out, referring to Kevin Kerr's previous statement that these folks who are pushing term limits, their days are numbered and their family and heirs will be outcasts. Tatum says, I hope they're wiped out. Kevin Kerr agrees. Kevin Kerr also adds Yoweri Museveni, spelled the name wrong, from Uganda. Right? NYC Beauties gives a smile at Tatum's on they should be wiped out. Recently, the crop of coup d'etats in Africa has added a new dimension to the problems of political instability. It is interesting that the African governments are reacting in roughly the same way. The trend now is to politicize the armed forces. In Ghana, the top military leadership is being assimilated into the CPP elite. Recruitment and promotion in the Nigerian armed forces now seeks to balance among Igbos, Yorubas, and Hausas. The idea is to dilute the group consciousness of the military by making it reflect the country's political and tribal tension. Julius Nyerere has just started to build a new army drawn from Tanu youth. Sekou Toure liquidated Guinea's old colonial army by gradually resettling its 50,000 veterans and launched the quote-unquote the new national army with 2,000 PDG recruits. As he told the École Nationale Militaire in June 1961, the training of the new army was to be quote-unquote in accordance with the requirements of the national revolution. The Guinean army is now intimately associated with and influenced by the PDG at every level because all its members are also members of the PDG. It is important to understand that the growing uniformity of policies and institutions in Africa which we are postulating is primarily the work of circumstances, from what we have said, it is clear that the phenomenon will occur even without Pan-Africanism. But as we have shown, Pan-Africanism reinforces it by exposing African peoples more to one another and by stressing the essential similarities of their problems. I don't see a problem with that. By emphasizing the uniqueness of Africa's experience and culture, Pan-Africanism emboldens African leaders to adopt solutions, unorthodox by Western standards, but required by Africa's difficult circumstances. No one reading the policy statements of African governments can fail to notice the recurrence of the same cliches and the fact that every rationalization usually begins with the uniqueness of the African society. Again, while it is sometimes contemptible to copy Western institutions, it is quite respectable to copy those of other African governments. An imitator has the added confidence of benefiting from an experience that is directly relevant to his. The influence of Pan-Africanism on African governments, then, is in the general direction of authoritarianism and institutional uniformity. Although this does not imply that Pan-Africanism is the only factor pressuring in these directions, or there are no aspects of the movement which counteract these tendencies. You know, what aspects of Pan-Africanism counteract authoritarianism? This essay has been merely exploratory. A fuller appreciation of the impact of Pan-Africanism on African governments must await more rigorous research. It is sufficient for our present purpose if we have focused attention on an unwisely neglected theme in African studies. Pan-Africanism as an idea system and as a program of action is an important determinant of the behavior of African governments. Right? That's a good line at the end here. Right? Pan-Africanism as an idea system and as a program of action is an important determinant of the behavior of African governments. In the chat room, Kevin Kerr says to Teetums, also known as Baka, look at how the Romanovs were wiped out by the Bolsheviks. KW Don 7 says we have not moved since the 60s. I mean, really, after you listen to the reading of this paper, how much has that dial moved from the 1960s? You know, 60 years later, how much has the dial moved? Now, we could talk about the interference of foreigners and all that stuff, right? But shouldn't we really be talking also about, or probably even chiefly about, the inaction of Africa's leadership, right? Which again, I know is influenced by these folks, but at some point we got to break out of the influence. In the chat room, KW Don 7 says there hasn't been anyone in the mainstream who has articulated the Pan-African struggle since Malcolm X, and more recently, Khalid Abdul Muhammad. Side note, as I go take this last commercial break, have you guys been seeing all the Twitter and social media talk of, you know, trying to exonerate the NOI from Malcolm's murder in light of the recent news that came out that the NYPD was involved? Well, to me, they all were involved. Literally, NOI folks pulled the trigger, right? And the PD, the New York PD, allowed them to be able to do it. And literally, we listened to Farrakhan talk about what they did to Malcolm and whose business it is what they did. My God. You know, that's the problem with time. Time and these these folks who want to change history can be a big problem for black folks. Let me take a quick station ID break. I'll be back on the other side with my question I want to ask the folks who are here. Before that, too, I also want to put this question out there. What type of content would you like to hear? Do you want to hear the same type of content I've been putting out in these live streams, or do you want me to incorporate something else? What other, or what instead would you like to hear from this channel? Let me know that on the other side of the station ID break.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
All right, and we're back. Make sure to check out the Queen's Council podcast as well. In the chat room, we still got some activity. We have KW Don 7 saying, in the current context, the only person who has communicated the Pan-African struggle is Umar Johnson. But he has a lot of controversy attached to his name. And that's the thing that's holding him back. He has the controversy, and he looks kind of crazy with some of the stuff he does, which adds to the controversy. You know, the thing about the school, at one point I thought here that he did purchase a school. Now I have some doubts based on some other stuff I'm seeing, you know, but he has a kind of a grifter's air about him. And I think that holds him back, you know. Because the cool thing about him is that even though I think he might be Muslim, he doesn't really push the whole religious thing out there. He deals exactly with what needs to be dealt with. He talks about black empowerment, etc. He talks about education, he talks about children and psychology and all that stuff that I like. But he has the history here that makes him look a little bit crazy. I want to thank y'all guys for tuning in tonight. I hope you guys liked the paper that we read. Hope you liked the discussion that we had in between. And I'd like to know from you guys, what you know, that's my big question at the end here. What other content, or are you... Let's do it like this. If you're good with the content that I've been putting out, press 1 in the chat. If you'd like to see this similar content, but other content as well, hit me with a 2. Right? But Titums Baku says, what about Kemi Seba? I do not know Kemi Seba. Let me look up Kemi Seba right now. Tell us about Kemi Seba, Baku. What should we know about Kemi Seba? So I see that Kemi Seba is a young dude too. Born in 81, Pan-Africanist, political leader, French, Beninese writer, geopolitical journalist. He's given lectures about Pan-Africanism in many African universities. He's the author. He's the initiator of the demonstrations against the CFA franc. Okay, this is something I gotta look into. Is he associated with the New Black Panther Party? The appointed Capo Chichi, the party's representative in France. Okay. All right. So okay, I'm gonna look into that brother a little bit more. So Baku comes in and says he's a Pan-African brother that lives in Benin. He talks a lot about the Pan-African struggle from the Francophone world. Yeah, you know, that's the thing, man. Like, you know, when you, let's say you're let's say you're an English speaker, right? You kind of tend to be separated from, say, the French-speaking world, right? Derrico Cooper photography. I haven't seen Derrico Cooper photography here, but he types 1. Okay, and I appreciate that. I wasn't aware we had another photography group here. NYC Beauties typed 1 to my question. KW Don 7 typed 1. He also says the NOI is guilty of the Malcolm X murder. The FBI and the NYPD knew it was going to happen and allowed it. Yeah, they're all a part of it. Right? The Pro-Black Perspective says, I was meaning to ask. A lot of paper we should do on the air. There's more an article than a paper though. Yeah, I'm down. Whenever you want to do it, just not Monday evenings. I teach on Monday evenings. You let me know when you're down. Send me the paper too so I can read it ahead. If you want to do a joint discussion, we can do that. No problem. It's been a while since we've done something joint too, by the way. Tatum says Umar has no credibility. Julius Malema is starting to articulate the Pan-African struggle, but I cannot take him seriously due to his support of the vaccine and the LGBTQRSTUV WXYZ death star. Kevin Care42 typed 1 to my answer. So you guys want to see me do more of this type of content, more papers, etc. Okay, that's not a problem. I did say the other day, and I will from time to time in the future start doing topics like I did back in the day when I used to pre-record the show. I think I'll still do some kind of presentation type stuff. But yeah, Pro-Black Perspective, what you trying to say, let me know. You know, send me the paper. You see the email up there. Send me the paper. Let's schedule it. Let's do it. You guys will be cool with hearing a joint podcast between the Pro-Black Perspective and the Bitter Medicine podcast, right? Type one of you be down for that. Tatum says Malema is suspect. Derrico Cooper Photography says absolutely. So I guess he's saying absolutely to the I'm thinking he's saying absolutely to the crossover. Tatum says I used to believe in him, but now I don't. That's the thing, man. We have got to work on our image as lead. If you're going to be a leader, when I say leader, I'm not even talking like world leaders. I'm talking leaders in your family, you know, leaders amongst your peers. If you're going to be leaders, you know, you got to work on your image. Image is everything. Although I'm starting to see more and more in Black society, image doesn't seem to be as big as it probably used to be. Because we see the entertainers, like Tatum's is just talking about, he's wary of the entertainers, right? We see the problem with entertainers. We see folks hustling, you know, Black empowerment. We see folks hustling anti-Pan-Africanism. And I'm sure there's probably someone out here hustling Pan-Africanism. Well, I guess you could say Umar, right? And we've got to get rid. We have to really work on image, and I'm not talking about, you know, image control. I'm talking about serious people, right? Who are serious about doing the work. They're not caught up in the nonsense. Like I saw a dude today. If you guys are on Twitter, you probably follow Ghetto Intellectual, and he's arguing with a guy back and forth about Elijah Muhammad getting some underage girls pregnant. Here he comes talking about they weren't underage, they were at least 20 years old. And there was this one lady who said she was 18 when she met Malcolm, but she was 20 something. And so then the argument changed. Well, at least he got multiple women pregnant. And then this guy who's taking up for the Elijah Muhammads and them, he's talking like, what's the problem with a man getting pussy? And I'm sorry to be harsh, but that's how he said it. Right? We really got to start working on, I'm not saying you have to be altar boys or priests or something like that, but my God, let's be a little bit better. You know? Derico Cooper Photography says, I have been to 8 countries on the continent, 2 years on the ground collectively. Kudos. So guys, this was another episode of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Again, I hope you guys enjoyed the show. I hope you guys enjoyed the paper that was read. Look forward to perhaps the Pro-Black Perspective and I doing a joint show in the near future. And you know, if you're new here, make sure to like the show, subscribe to the channel, click the bell so that you're notified when I'm on again. Right? Share the show too to people who you think would get benefit from it. Make sure to share the show. And also, you know, check out KWZ Radio YouTube channel. Let's get more likes and subscriptions on that channel as well. All right. There's some things coming down the line from the channel, from the YouTube channel there. We're going to start putting out snippets of all the shows. Right. So yeah, I appreciate you guys in the chat room. Let me shout you guys out. Tedums, Kevin Care 42. Tedums, Kevin Care 42. Derico Cooper Photography, thanks for coming through. I don't know if this is your first time here, but if it's not, make sure you subscribe and like the video. I appreciate you for being here and giving some input. KW Don 7 as always, right? NYC Beauties as well. I appreciate all of you. The Pro-Black Perspective. The Pro-Black Perspective says, LOL, no one typed 1. Maybe it's not desired. Again, I'll put the question out there to you guys. Would you guys be interested in listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast crossover with the Pro-Black Perspective to discuss Julius Nyerere? Type 1 if you do, 2 if you don't. The Pro-Black Perspective says, I missed that ghetto intellectual convo. I blocked him, LOL. And he blocked me too. Yeah, I remember you guys had some back and forth after the centennial celebration or something. KW Don 7 says type number 1. So Pro-Black Perspective, you could stop tearing up the sheets, tying your noose, you know? I'm just kidding. Kevin K42 says LOL. Derico Cooper Photography says thank you, Kevin, and he says subscribed. Beautiful. Also, if you guys aren't already, let me post this in the chat room. If you guys aren't already, or someone can post it for me in the chat room, the what you call it, the link, the invite link to the Discord server. If you aren't on the server yet, hop on the server. There's the link in the chat right now. Hop on the server and join us, and ask how you can help. We're working on an updated African-centered curriculum, so you guys could join that. If you just want to be a fan of the show, you can join, and we can give you that role too. You can be a fan of the show. Tatum says KZ Shabazz. Yes, I think yes, KZ Shabazz. Absolutely, that's what I said. I figured a few of you will know who I'm talking about. Derico Cooper typed 1, so he's down for the crossover. The pro-black perspective puts his noose back in the closet. Yeah, good idea. You know, at least until we do the show, right? No, I'm just kidding. Good idea. Y'all check out the Warships on Sundays, man. Like I tell you, I listen to that show oftentimes two times at least during a week. It's one of my shows that I listen to. Derico Cooper says, love the content. I appreciate you guys for checking me out. Tatum's also hit 1, so now you can put the noose further back in the closet. The pro-black perspective. Anyway, guys, that's been my time, and I appreciate you giving me your time. We will speak again on Saturday. You know the deal. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, I'm on live. Check me out on Saturday. We should have something fun to do, something fun to discuss. Until next time, this has been the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.